please feel free, if you want to ask a question, you're more than welcome. The topic for today is the Oral Torah, which I'm sure most of you know something about it, but I want to present it in a more comprehensive, structured form. I want to give credit where credit is due. Most of the information I took for this class is from a book called A Handbook of Jewish Thought by a very great rabbi who is in the world of truth now. He unfortunately passed away at a very young age, but made an incredible contribution to Jewish writings. His name is Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. You may have heard of him. He wrote many, many amazingly scholarly books, and has passed away quite a few years ago at a young age. But I did use his book, Handbook of Jewish Thought, as the source book for a lot of what I'm using, plus some different things from different places. So I just want to give credit to him and thank you to him. This should be an aliyah for his neshama. Okay, so first of all, the Torah comes in two parts, the written Torah and the oral Torah. In Hebrew, it's called Torah shebechsav and Torah sheba'al peh. Bechsav means in writing, and ba'al peh means by heart, meaning oral. Ba'al peh actually means by mouth, which is exactly oral. The written Torah consists of 24 books. You probably know this. 5 books of the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, which would start with, Bereshis, how's that in English again? Genesis, and goes through till the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's lifetime when he passes the reins to Yehoshua, which is actually in this week's Parsha. Moshe passes the authority to Yehoshua shortly before his passing. So the 5 books of the Chumash, of the Torah, are from the beginning of the creation of the world until the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu as the Jews are about to enter Israel. And the 5 books of Moses were dictated verbatim by God to Moshe. The book of Devarim, the 5th of the 5 books, it says that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, spoke through Moshe Rabbeinu's throat. But Rabbi Kaplan explains that even though it was Moshe on his own initiative, that's why it's in first person. Moshe speaks as I, instead of when he says, I will give you rain, and rather than he will give you rain, because he was speaking on behalf of God, but it was still the exact word of God, just through a human throat. And Moshe Rabbeinu had risen to such a high level. But the 5 books of Moses are defined as the exact verbatim word of God. The next 8 books of what we call the Tanakh, which is the Torah, which we just said, the 5 books, the Nevi'im, which are the books of prophets, and the Kesuvim, which are the books of scriptures. So the first 5, there are 24 altogether. The first 5 are what we just said, the 5 books of Moses. The next 8 are the books of prophets. The prophets, such as Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and then all the 12 minor prophets, were not so minor, like the book of Jonah, what we read on Yom Kippur. Those books were written by men. They were not dictated by God. They were prophecies that were gotten by very righteous Jewish leaders called prophets, who then wrote it over in their own words based on the prophecies that they received from God. So it is not the exact word of God, but it is a revelation from God given over by very holy people in their own words. Then you have the Kesuvim, the next 11 books, the final 11 books of what we call the Tanakh, the written Torah, which include Tehillim. It includes the 5 Megillos, like Megillas Esther, and other books, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, various different books are included, the book writings of King Solomon, Song of Songs, etc., Proverbs. And those books were not written through prophecy. Those books were written through divine inspiration. Now, I've never had prophecy or divine inspiration, so I cannot tell you the exact technical difference. It is a somewhat lower level of revelation of godliness, but it is still a revelation of godliness. And it was written by very holy people who were inspired by God to write these works. Sometimes you have a prophet who at times would get prophecy and at other times would get divine inspiration, such as the prophet Jeremiah. Yirmiyahu wrote the book of Yirmiyahu. It's one of the books of the prophets with prophecy. He also wrote the scroll of Eicha, Lamentations, which we were going to read on Tisha B'Av, which was not given to him through prophecy, but through divine inspiration. So the same person can at times have prophecy and at other times have divine inspiration. But divine inspiration is quite deep and quite godly. I'm sure that probably all of you attending this class have heard this before, but I'll just mention in case there's even one person who has it. In the book of Esther, if you read by the 10 sons of Haman, it has 3 small letters. A Tuf is small, a Shin is small, and a Zion is small. And if you look into any Megillah, handwritten Megillah, you will see those 3 small letters. It's very prominent. For decades, or I should say centuries, the Megillah was faithfully recorded. It was written that way by Mordechai and Esther, and it was faithfully recorded with these small letters, and nobody knew why. And in the Megillah, there is an inconsistency. After the 10 sons of Haman are already hung, Esther asked for permission to hang the 10 sons of Haman. And what happened was, in Tuf Shin Zion, which is hinted at in the Megillah, although nobody knew what it was till then, which would be 1947, 10 Nazis were hung at the Nuremberg trials. And we believe that the Nazis are the descendants of Amalek, which was Haman. So that was divine inspiration that caused Mordechai and Esther, that when Esther was asking to kill the 10 sons of Haman, she had divine inspiration for the future. There will be another 10 sons of Haman that will be hung in 1947, Tuf Shin Zion. So when we say divine inspiration, I don't want to make light of it. It's in a way to us looks prophetic, but compared to prophecy, it's not quite on the same level. But to us, it's almost the same. Okay, so those are the 24 books of what we call the Tanakh. The Tanakh was sealed by Ezra and his colleagues, which would be in the very, very beginning days of the Second Temple. It was at the end of the 70 years of Babylonian exile, and which we spoke about last week. At the very, very beginning, Ezra lived just at the early, early beginnings of the Second Holy Temple, and around that time, prophecy stopped, and the Tanakh was sealed. There will never be another book added to the Tanakh. So these are the permanent 24 books of the written Torah. Our class for today is the Oral Torah. So let's see what that is. The Oral Torah today we think of as the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Code of Jewish Law, etc. But where does all this come from, and what's the significance of it, and why did Hashem give it separately? There's a lot of questions. So first, before I even get to all those questions, I want to just address the fact that you can see from the written Torah, which we believe is the exact word of God, quite a few hints that God, in fact, gave Moses, an oral Torah simultaneously with the written Torah. When he went up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and then he goes up a second time on Mount Sinai to pray for the Jews. Then he goes up a third time on Mount Sinai to get the second tablets. So the first and third trip up to Mount Sinai, he was there for 40 days and 40 nights when God taught him the Torah. And the second time, God taught him more of the oral Torah. He taught him halacha, he taught him the medrash. He did that the first time too, but more so the second time. So we believe the Torah itself indicates to us that this is the case. For example, I'll give you 3 examples. Number 1, regarding the slaughter of a kosher animal, it says in the book of Devarim, the 5th book of the Torah, that you shall slaughter the animal as I have commanded you. You can search the entire Chumash, you will not find any instructions of how to slaughter an animal. But yet it says, as I have commanded you, which indicates that God explained to Moshe how to do it orally. That's one indication. Another indication is we have the mitzvah of tefillin. I don't think anyone today would question that tefillin are black boxes with straps with scrolls inside. But if you look in the Chumash, doesn't mention black boxes, doesn't mention a strap, doesn't mention any of this. It just says that you should put them for a sign on your arm and for frontlets between your eyes. There's no clear indication of how to do it. And obviously, you can't have everybody making up their idea of what's a sign and what's a frontlet. We all accept that tefillin is tefillin, and that is because God explained that to him orally in the oral Torah when he gave him that mitzvah of tefillin in the written Torah. Another very important example would be Shabbos. We know there are many, many rules and laws about how to keep Shabbos, and they're not found in the Torah. Torah just says keep Shabbos, remember Shabbos, observe Shabbos, don't light a fire in your dwelling places. That's about it. And we know that there is many, many, many details of Shabbos. If everybody was left to their own to figure out how to keep Shabbos, we wouldn't have a Shabbos. Everybody would just do whatever they like to do on vacation. It wouldn't be Shabbos. So clearly, in the Oral Torah, you have the 39 categories of work that were forbidden on Shabbos with all the details. So there are many, many indications in the written Torah, which is the word of God, that God himself tells us that he gave an Oral Torah simultaneously. The question is, why? Why didn't God was not running out of ink, was not running out of stones on the tablet, wasn't running out of parchment later. Why did God choose to give it in these two very distinct separate divisions? And there are many explanations offered. I cannot tell you God's exact reason because God has not told us this, in exactly so many words, but there are many indications of why, what benefit, let's put it that way, not God's reasons, but what benefit we derive from the fact that God gave the two Torahs separately. First of all, because it's an oral tradition, it necessitates teachers and students. Many people can read a book and come to very different conclusions. When you're learning student to teacher to student, it's explained, it's elaborated, and you understand it much better, and there's a much bigger chance that it will be kept in a unified way, that the teachers will learn together, explain it, and it's the same way, like I work in a school, right? So the principal can give out memos. She doesn't have to have meetings. What's the advantage of a meeting? When the principal says it orally, it takes on a different force. She's there to explain. She's there. In a memo, you could say, oh, I thought you meant this. I thought you meant that. So one of the big advantages of an oral Torah is that you have face-to-face, teacher to teacher. By the way, for adults, Zoom seems to be fine, but everybody will tell you that the year that the kids were on Zoom, they learned almost nothing because it wasn't face-to-face. And most kids were not capable of learning without a physical presence of a teacher. So the oral Torah makes it a necessity to have this contact, this oral face-to-face connection from teacher to student, from generation to generation. Another thing is that there's an infinite number of cases that could come up in Jewish law. And King Solomon himself says in the book of Koheles, which is one of the books of Kesuvim or scriptures, that there's no end to many books. God could have written book after book after book after book, and it would be endless. You'd never get to every single possible case. So instead, God gave in the oral Torah the principles of how to derive things from the written Torah, so that when cases will come up, we will have the tools to be able to figure out all the different cases that will come up, and we don't have to be sitting tediously and studying, and I wouldn't say thousands, millions of the infinite number of cases. Rather, he gave us a toolbox, not us, the leaders, the sages, a toolbox of how to be able to figure things out as they come up. So he gave us many cases in the Torah, and then the toolbox to deal with all the other cases that would come up in the future. Another benefit, I should say, of the oral Torah is that we have a central authority, which we're going to learn about a little bit later in the class, about the Sanhedrin, the high court, the supreme court of the Jewish people. And that created a unity that Jewish people all over the world, all Jewish women all over the world are lighting candles at the same time Friday night. And this is a tremendous unity among the Jewish people that was established by the fact that we have this central authority, and it's not just everybody doing their own thing. And a very, very important benefit of the oral Torah is another thing, not related to these other ideas of unity and authority. And that is that God told Moshe that there will come a time, now I'm telling you that you're the chosen people, but there will come a time when other nations will question your status, and they will say that God once chose you, but now he has rejected you. There are religions that claim that we're no longer the chosen people, that God rejected us. And at that time, they'll say that the Torah belongs to them now. So you will be able to say, let the one who understands the Torah claim it. The fact that we have the oral Torah gives us the ability to understand the Torah really, of what God really means. And therefore, God did not want the oral Torah to be accessible to just anyone. He wanted it to be orally transmitted privately, so to speak, from generation of Jews to generation of Jews. And it wasn't written down until centuries later, when the other religions of the world who were questioning us already had their statutes, they already had their canons, they already had their system of belief, and therefore the oral Torah would be shown to be the property of the Jewish people, and therefore the Torah is what God gave to his chosen nation. Not to say that other people can't study the Bible, they can, but still, when we are challenged that God didn't really mean the Torah for the Jewish people, then we will be able to say that because we have the oral Torah, that is the proof that the Torah does belong primarily to the Jewish people. So these are all various insights into the benefits that we accrued from the fact that God separated the written and the oral Torah. Okay, now I'd like to go through the chain of transmission, because first of all, I want to make a general statement that Judaism, unlike some other religions, not that we have to compare, but Judaism has an unbroken chain from Moses, even further back, even to Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov, and back to creation. But there's an unbroken chain. We can tell you who were the leaders and scholars in every generation, tell you their biographies, tell what they taught and how they taught it. And there is no gap whatsoever from the time of Moses till today. It's really an amazing thing, because many times in other nations, other religions, there are these very big gaps, sometimes gaps of many generations, even hundreds of years. So there is absolutely no gap. That's number one. And there is no reason in the world to question the chain of tradition. People are quicker to accept the fact that there was a George Washington whom they never met than to accept the oral tradition, which is clearly, when Jews all over the world began to be able to communicate, Jews who had been in isolated communities for hundreds or even 1,000 years, when they got together, they found they had the same Torah. So the tradition is self-evident that it's been unbroken, and we can account for every single generation without missing even a year. And we'll go through a little bit of that later. Okay, but let's see where it all began. When God gave the Torah to Moshe on Mount Sinai, he gave him, as we said, the written and the oral Torah. There are some traditions that say that he learned the written Torah by day and the oral tradition by night. Doesn't really matter. God taught him everything. The actual Chumash, the actual 5 books of Moses, God revealed to Moshe. Moshe wrote down, and when he came down from Mount Sinai, when he gave the Torah the first tablets, he wrote down, God dictated him till the giving of the Torah. And then as they traveled through the desert the next year, he continued writing. And then for 38 years, there was no addition. And in the last year, before they went into Israel, Moshe completed the writing of the Torah. But the written Torah, as we said, was written. So we have that record, there's no question. The oral Torah was transmitted as follows. Moshe would gather together Aaron, his brother, Aaron's sons, the 70 elders, whom we're going to talk about more soon, and the Jewish people. And he would teach it first to Aaron, then he would teach it to Aaron and his sons. Aaron's hearing it the second time. Then he would teach it to the elders. So now Aaron's hearing it the third time, his sons the second time, the elders the first time, etc. And this way, everybody heard this tradition taught over many times. Part of this tradition is that Moshe was given various different methods of extrapolating things from the written Torah. There is a Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yosef HaGlili, who we're going to later establishes 32 principles of how we extrapolate laws and how we extrapolate ideas from the Torah. Actually, in the daily prayers, you have the 13 methods of Rabbi Yishmael. Just to give you an example what a method is. You have, for example, what's called kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer means that if this is so, how much more so is that so? There's a Greek name for it, but I forget. But it's just comparing one to the other. There's also a gezerah shava, which means if it uses this word in one sentence and uses the exact same word in another sentence, you compare the two sentences and you can derive things from it. And there's a whole list of various methods that God gave to Moses of how to be able to learn things from the oral Torah that were not specified and spelled out. Now, actually, a lot of what Moshe got on Mount Sinai is what we call halacha l'Moshe miSinai, which means specific rulings given to Moshe that were never questioned and don't need extrapolation. For example, in the Chumash, it says, on Sukkot, one of the fruits you should take for the 4 kinds is the fruit of a tree of glory, a pre-Eitz Hadar. You will not find the word esrog. But Moshe Rabbeinu was told that a pre-Eitz Hadar, the fruit of a tree of glory, is an esrog, a citron. That is not questioned. There isn't a Jew on the planet that uses a different fruit other than an esrog. Nobody thinks it's anything else because that is one of the halachos l'Moshe miSinai, meaning unquestioned, clear, straightforward law that Moshe was given that needs no interpretation. The same thing with tefillin. Nobody uses tefillin that are not black, that are not square, that don't have the portions of the Torah. Now, the question of what order to put the portions of the little scrolls in the tefillin, that does vary between Rashi and his grandson Rabbeinu Tam. But the basic mitzvah of tefillin is halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and all of these things that are clear-cut and explicit laws are about 50% of the Oral Torah is undisputed, clear directives given to Moshe, which were passed down from generation to generation and never disputed and never questioned. The other 50%, approximately, I'm going by Rabbi Kaplan's count, I certainly didn't count it, are those things which need to be derived through these various methods of interpretation that God gave to Moshe. So about half the Torah is not disputed at all. It's clear-cut, given explicitly. The other half needed to be derived as we went through the centuries. Every time a rule was derived, it had to be confirmed by what we call the Sanhedrin, the High Court, that we're going to get to soon. Okay. Very often, the books of the prophets will reinforce something which was in the Oral Torah. For example, you have in the book of Yeshaya where it says that on Shabbos you should not be involved in mundane pursuits. That isn't spelled out in the Chumash, but spelled out in the Navi. Where did he get it from? It was already established by the Oral Torah. So since the Navi came later than the books of the Nevi'im, the prophets came later, so you have in the Nevi'im some confirmation of numerous laws that were already in effect, but that were already confirmed by the authorities in the Oral Torah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Sanhedrin, the High Court of the Jewish people. The first High Court of the Jewish people was appointed directly by God. God told Moshe by lottery to choose the 70 elders. And Moshe is the 71st. He's what's called the Nasi, or the Av, based in Rosh Yeshiva, or the Nasi, the prince or the head of the yeshiva, so to speak. And that was directly ordained by God. That court then had the authority to ordain new judges as needed. So the original appointment was by God himself in the days of Moses, and then till the Sanhedrin was disbanded, which was many, many years later, in the early days, during the days of the Second Holy Temple. Then I'm going to give you the date exactly. I don't want to say it wrong. I don't want to say something incorrect. I have it written in another place. I'll get to it later, the exact date. But when the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of the Jewish people, was disbanded, since that time, there's no more what we call official smicha. Smicha today is that a rabbi goes to a yeshiva and he studies and he becomes an expert in Jewish law, but he is not officially ordained to going back to Moses. He's just a scholar who helps us understand the law to a limited extent of what is permitted today. And we'll see what those very strong limits are soon. So the Sanhedrin, the original court under Moses, and as they were for many, many generations, I believe it was 40 generations of Sanhedrin, they had three powers of authority. One authority was to carefully transmit what we said before, the halachos that Moshe were given the Har Sinai to carefully transmit how to do tefillin, carefully transmit how to do Shabbos, carefully transmit all these, how to slaughter an animal, all these things. One of their big responsibilities was faithful transmission of the explicit tradition. The second authority they had was to extrapolate, which we said, according to very specific rules. Once they extrapolated a law, then it had to be presented to the entire Sanhedrin. It had to be approved, and then it became an official part of the Oral Torah. If there was ever a dispute as to what the correct interpretation is, then it went by majority rule. That is also a law in the Torah, in the Chumash, it says to go by majority rule in such cases. Very often there was no debate, it was just easily settled. Sometimes it did have to go to a vote. And once it's voted upon, that becomes part of the Oral Torah. Another authority that they have is to add things to the Torah. Now that's a little tricky because there's a law, one of the laws in the written Torah is not to add to the Torah. So therefore there's very strict limitations on what they can add. The simple thing is they're allowed to add protections. They're allowed to add safeguards to the Torah, making it clear that this is not part of God's law. We are recommending this in order to safeguard the Torah. For example, we're really allowed to eat chametz on Erev Pesach much later in the day than when we currently do. But Ezra and his colleagues instituted that we should stop eating chametz several hours earlier in the day to make sure that we don't, God forbid, come close to accidentally having chametz on Pesach. So they extended how early you have to stop eating chametz on the 14th of Nisan. But they made it clear, this is what the Torah says, this is what we say, and it's a safeguard. The same thing that there's a whole topic on Shabbos called muktzah, that we don't touch certain things that we're not supposed to use. We're not supposed to write, so we don't touch a pencil or a pen. That is clearly, they made it very, very clear. They made a clear distinction. This is what is biblically forbidden. We are adding this as a safeguard. And as long as they don't claim that God said so, but we are adding it as a safeguard, they have the authority to do that. And then we are obligated to follow it. Now, the only distinction between divine law and rabbinic law only comes up in case of emergency. For example, if on Shabbos a life is in danger, we all know you have to break Shabbos to save a life. But if you have a choice of how to break Shabbos, and one of them involves a biblical violation of Shabbos, and the other one involves a rabbinic violation, if you have a choice, and if you know the law, and you don't sit around looking up books when someone's life is in danger, but if someone is knowledgeable and knows how to choose, you would rather break a rabbinic law than a biblical law if each one will equally be able to save the person's life. So there are occasions when we might make a distinction between divine and rabbinic law, but basically once a rabbinic law like muktzah comes into effect, we don't say, well, I don't have to keep muktzah, I'll be careful. Once it's law, it's law. But the reason it's permitted is because in the Torah, one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is not to turn aside from the teachings of the sages to the right or to the left, meaning that they have the authority to enact things which they feel are important to safeguard the Torah, and then they become law. And again, there's only a distinction between biblical and rabbinic law is made sometimes in cases of emergency, but otherwise we should not make these distinctions. Once it's law, it becomes God's will. There is one more area where they have authority, which is again given by the Torah, and that is to establish things such as when is the new moon, when is a leap year, which they count the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle. These things are not individual things. These are done by the rabbinic authority of the time. But that is clearly stated in the Torah that you should do these things, but it's under their jurisdiction. It's not a new thing they're doing. We are commanded to count the Shemitah, for example, but it's not an individual mitzvah, it's a collective mitzvah of the High Court. And then comes the last one, which is the most difficult to explain, to understand, And that is that the sages actually made 7 new rabbinic mitzvos, for which when we do them, we make a bracha and we say, God, you have Baruch Atah Hashem, you all know the blessing, blessed are you, God, that has commanded us, a king of the world who has commanded us in the observance of the mitzvahs and has commanded us to, for example, read the Megillah on Purim, or light the menorah on Hanukkah, or make an Eruv, or light candles. There are 7 rabbinic mitzvos, which means there's 613 biblical and 7 more rabbinic that took on the status of a mitzvah, not just a safeguard, but an actual mitzvah. And therefore, there are very few, there's only 7. And in the case of each one, there was a clear tradition to begin with. For example, we know that Sarah Imenu, the first Jewish woman, lit candles, even though the Torah wasn't even given yet, and yet she knew about the written Torah and the oral Torah and already lit candles. So there's firm tradition for it. And it had to be clearly stipulated, clearly, that we all have to know these are rabbinic. And there are, for example, when Mordechai and Esther wanted to establish the holiday of Purim, there was great opposition. You can't make a new mitzvah. And the great sages at that time, using the tools that we spoke about, determined that under the circumstances, there was authority for them to establish this mitzvah, but everybody needs to know this is a rabbinic mitzvah. Because you can't say God gave it, because he didn't. There was no Mordechai and Esther when the Torah was given. Yet, we also find hints in the Torah. For example, it says that in the time of exile, and this is in the Chumash, Aster panai mikem. I will hide my face from them. That's in the Chumash. And our sages tell us that Aster is a hint for Esther, that God is telling us that someday his miracles will not be revealed miracles like the splitting of the sea. There will be the hidden miracles as in the days of Purim. And that's why Esther's name was Esther, which comes from the word lahastir, to hide. So in the Chumash, there is a hint that someday the sages will make this mitzvah. But it was still debated strongly. And in the end, the majority decision was to establish the holiday of Purim to recognize the great miracles of God. But everybody knows that this is rabbinic and not biblical. And yet it is absolutely binding to the point where we make a bracha that God has commanded us regarding the reading of the Megillah. By the way, the 7 rabbinic mitzvos are Hanukkah. You want to write? The 7 rabbinic mitzvos are Hanukkah, Purim, lighting candles, washing the Tilas Yadayim like for bread, making an Eruv, let me see, making a bracha, and which you don't say a bracha to make a bracha, so that's the one there's no bracha for it, and Hallel. Saying Hallel certain times of the year, certain holidays, is, and we say, Asher Kedeshana b'mitzvos v'tzivanu likro es Hallel. It's a commandment to read the Hallel. It's not biblical, it's rabbinic. Those are the 7 rabbinic mitzvos.
Can you please repeat that, those 7, please?
Yes. Purim, Hanukkah, lighting Shabbos candles, washing Netilas Yadayim, making an Eruv, to be allowed to carry in the neighborhood on Shabbos, making a bracha before we eat or smell or the various things, and the last one is saying Hallel on various occasions. There will never be another rabbinic mitzvah because only a Sanhedrin, which we don't have anymore today, as we said, was disbanded, can make an actual mitzvah. No one has that authority anymore. Now, I just want to mention that the sages also, it's actually in today's study of the daily class, we study a mitzvah of the Rambam each day, and today's mitzvah happens to be, talks about the establishment of when is the new month and when is there leap years. That was also a function of the High Court. And without that, we don't know when our holiday should be, because it all depends on when is Rosh Chodesh, like if you the establishment of the new month. So the question is, if it takes a Sanhedrin to establish this and there's no Sanhedrin, how do we have holidays anymore? What do we do? So the truth is, it's an amazing thing. Shortly before the Sanhedrin disbanded, a great sage by the name of Hillel HaKatan, to be distinguished from the great Hillel that you're familiar with. There's another sage called Hillel. They call him Hillel the Small, compared to Hillel, the famous Hillel that you know, the Hillel the Great. He made a system of how to calculate all the new moons till the coming of Mashiach. And at that time, when there was still a Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin decreed every Rosh Chodesh from then till the coming of Mashiach. So it's not us who are determining when the new moon is. They made a mathematical system, which is actually the most brilliant piece of mathematics ever done without a computer. It was done thousands of years ago, and it's still accurate till today. There are actually 14 patterns of what a year can have, and everything was set into motion then, and it's perfect to this day. And therefore the Rambam says that the Sanhedrin is still decreeing to this very day our Rosh Chodeshes, our holidays, that was made in advance, knowing that the Sanhedrin would be disbanded. They made it for the next few thousand years till the coming of Mashiach, that it was already put into place then. Because otherwise we would have no authority to do so. And you can't live as Jews without knowing when is Rosh Chodesh and when are the holidays. So this was a function of the Sanhedrin. Okay. I just want to mention also that in Pirkei Avos, it says clearly, Pirkei Avos is, we're going to see, as part of the Oral Torah. It describes the chain of tradition as going from Moshe to Yehoshua, to the elders of his generation, to the prophets, to the men of the Great Assembly that we already spoke about, Ezra and Mordechai and those generations of Jews till the time of Shimon HaTzadik, who was in the days of Alexander the Great. And then that led up to the compilation of the Mishnah, which will be the first time in Jewish history that the oral Torah will be put into writing. It was never allowed to be written except with personal notes, but it was never allowed to be officially written down until the days of, it was around the time of the destruction of the first Holy Temple, and even a little bit before, when they realized that the Jews are they're being persecuted, they're going to go into exile, and they would not have the peace of mind to have the scholarly meetings and the scholarly debates and classes that they had, and that there was a danger that perhaps the oral Torah, which was transmitted so faithfully and carefully for all these generations, might start to be forgotten or misinterpreted. So to avoid that, the sages of that generation determined, they based it on the pasuk in Tehillim, which says that there are times when in order to serve God, we have to break a rule in the Torah. And the rule in the Torah was to keep the oral Torah oral, and they saw that there was a danger in that. And based on their authority, which we said, they have the authority, we have to follow them, whether it's right or left, that they said that now has come the time when we must begin recording the oral Torah, otherwise it might get lost with time. So starting in those days, Rabbi Akiva put a preliminary text together. The great Rabbi Akiva, you've all heard of him. He lived just at the very beginning of the Common Era, just to give you a little idea of around when he was. He lived to see the destruction of the second Holy Temple, which was in the year 68 of the Common Era, and he was murdered by the Romans a number of years after that, about 60 years after that. And he had a preliminary form of the oral Torah written, but it was over a period of a couple hundred years that the sages worked on it, debated it, and finally, in the days of Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he is the one who's credited with taking all the various manuscripts, organizing them together with all the other sages of his generation, and putting it into the order of what we know now is the Mishnah. Mishnah either means teachings or it also means to repeat, because they used to memorize every paragraph of the oral Torah. They would repeat it over 100 times to make sure it was verbatim accurate. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the priest, completed the Mishnah in the year 188 of the Common Era. And the Mishnah has in it 6 different divisions, which are the division of seeds, which has all kinds of laws that have to do, all sections have to do with things that grow. In there, you would have the laws of Shemitah, for example, in the Zerayim and seeds. Moadim are the festivals, everything to do with Shabbos and holidays. Nashim, women, has to do with marriage and divorce. Nizikin are damages, civil laws. In there, you have the section called Sanhedrin, which describe the authority of the Sanhedrin in determining civil cases. You also have Pirkei Avos, which is ethical behavior. You're all familiar with Pirkei Avos, ethics of the fathers. That's also, even though it's not damages, it's still teaching us how to properly treat other people. Then you have Kadshim, which is holy things, such as the Holy Temple and various sacrifices. In there, you have one tractate called Midos, which is the measurements of the Beis Hamikdash, which the Rebbe encouraged us to learn that during the 3 weeks, to yearn and look forward to the building of the next Beis Hamikdash, the third and final Beis Hamikdash. And then you have Taharos, which is the laws of purity and impurity, including the laws of mikvah, including the laws of the red cow, which enables a person to become pure. So that is the 6 orders of the Mishnah, subdivided into 63 tractates. And this became the basis of the Oral Torah. Now, over the next few hundred years, by the way, the sages of the Mishnah are called the Tanaim. A Tana means someone who learns, someone who studies. Then you have several hundred years, you have the sages continuing to study the Oral Torah. By the way, among the most famous of the Tanaim are names I'm sure you've heard of. You would have Shammai and Avtalion, you may have heard of them. Hillel, the famous Hillel and Shammai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, some of the 10 martyrs. They would be the Tanaim, including Rabbi Akiva. The Amoraim would be the next group of scholars. They studied and expanded on the Mishnah by various scholarly debate based on the principles handed down. And again, in order to get into the Mishnah, it had to be ratified by the sages. Later, the Amoraim compiled the Gemara, and the Gemara also was ratified by the sages. There are opinions in the Gemara which were accepted. There are opinions which are rejected, but the rejected opinions are also included for 2 reasons. Number one, so they don't have to re-debate it again. It's already been rejected. And the other reason is because even though it was rejected as law, there's still a spiritual teaching to be benefited from it. And therefore, even the rejected opinions are included. So the famous Amoraim, Rav and Shmuel, Abaye and Rav, and many others. And finally, the Talmud, the Gemara, was put together by Rabbi Ashi. He died before it was fully completed, and his colleague Ravina completed the Talmud in, I heard either the year 500 or the year 505, but about 1500 plus years ago, the Talmud was sealed. And the Talmud is 37 tractates out of the 63 in the Mishnah. I guess they didn't get all of them. They did the ones that were more common, more needed for daily life. And so that is now the Mishnah and the Gemara make up the Talmud, which is the recorded body of the Oral Torah, which is no longer oral, it is now written. So what happens to the Oral Torah? We still have an Oral Torah. So there were 40 generations from Moshe until the Gemara, and that was my mistake before, I want to correct that. It was 40 generations from Moshe until the sealing of the Gemara. And all subsequent Oral Torah, which we're going to talk about now, must be in sync with the Gemara. Nothing can contradict the Gemara. That the Mishnah of the Gemara is absolutely accepted. And then we now have to have an oral tradition since the Oral Torah was sealed and there's no more official Oral Torah. It's the Talmud, that's it. So how do we live now? So the answer is that since the sealing of the Talmud, in every generation, there are sages. You had the Saboraim after the Tanaim, you had the Gaonim, you had the Rishonim, the early scholars. I don't think I have time to go through all of this. I prepared a lot more than I think we're going to cover. But there has to be an oral tradition that continues till today, because new things constantly come up. Like when electricity was discovered, they had to determine how do we categorize electricity? Can it be used on Shabbos, not used on Shabbos, how used on Shabbos? Is it limited? There was never electricity before. And there are things that come up in life. There are all kinds of cases that come up in life that maybe it's a new case that didn't come up before. And therefore, there is a tradition, but there are very specific rules that monitor that tradition. The Sanhedrin stopped trying capital cases in the year 28 of the Common Era. It moved to in the year 68, when the second Holy Temple was destroyed, it moved to Yavne, moved to other cities, but eventually the Sanhedrin was disbanded completely, and that would be in the year 358. There's no more smicha, no more handing down from one generation to the other. So since that time, these are the rules. Number one, there is no capital punishment allowed by the Torah. We're not talking about governments. We're talking about there's no rabbi, not in Israel, not anywhere in the world, that can try a capital case. Now, you are all familiar with the idea that people were hardly ever executed, even though there's a lot of laws in the Torah that require execution. It was almost never actually carried out because the requirements to satisfy in order to execute someone are so extreme that it could almost never happen. I'm not saying never ever, but extraordinarily rare. It says that a based in the executed once in, there's a difference of opinion, it was 7 years or 70 years, was called a bloody based in. In other words, it was a rare thing. But since the disbanding of the Sanhedrin, there is no capital punishment. There are not even fines and punitive damages anymore. A Jewish court today can only negotiate and try to find a settlement. Sometimes they'll rule against one person in favor of another. More often, they will try to reach a compromise because their authority is limited since they do not have the original smicha from Moshe Rabbeinu. It does say that right before Mashiach comes, that smicha will be reinstituted and Mashiach himself will be accepted by an existing Sanhedrin. So apparently the Sanhedrin will be reinstituted very soon because we're waiting very anxiously for the coming of Mashiach. There is a rule also that anything that a Sanhedrin made cannot be overruled in later generations by a new court. So the courts of today must follow all the previous rulings of the earlier Sanhedrin. That is why, for example, the earlier Sanhedrins instituted that we should have a second day of Yom Tov. We have 2 days of Yom Tov of Pesach and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, right? And Shavuos. We have an extra day of Yom Tov. It's called Yom Tov Sheni Shagolios, an extra day in the exile. Why? Because when they determined the new moon by looking at the moon, it took time to let everybody know, to notify everyone. And the people living far away might not find out in time when Rosh Chodesh is. There was a doubt of when the holiday would be. I mean, it's a whole discussion for itself. So they instituted the second day of Yom Tov for those living outside of Israel. So you could say, today we have calendars. We don't go out and look at the moon. And therefore, we don't need a second day of Yom Tov outside of Israel. But because it was made by a greater Sanhedrin than what we have today, it remains in force, even though the reason, the apparent reason no longer exists. So the Rebbe explained that even though the halachic reason might not exist, the spiritual reason does exist. And the spiritual reason, he says, is because you are able to get twice as much holiness in Israel as outside of Israel. So the holiness you need for Pesach or a Seder, you can get in one in Israel. Outside of Israel, it takes 2 Seders to get the same degree of holiness. And therefore, even though the halachic reason for the second day of Yom Tov does not exist anymore, by divine providence, we have to keep it because the spiritual reason does still exist. But still, the halachic law, the legal reason is that once a Sanhedrin makes something, no one of lesser authority can undo what they made. I just want to mention that even in the days of the Sanhedrin, the high court, there were lower courts in Israel as well. In small towns, there were judges of 3 on the panel. In larger cities, they had judges with 23 judges, but the Sanhedrin was the ultimate authority if the lower courts could not figure a ruling or it was challenged, it could go. It's like sort of like that's where the Supreme Court gets their idea from the Jewish Sanhedrin. 1 second, I just want to make sure. Okay. I also want to say that the Sanhedrin and later rabbinic authorities are permitted to institute customs as well. A custom that is widely accepted by the rabbinic authorities of that day and accepted by the Jewish people and lived takes on the force of law, of course, not as strong as an actual halacha, but we should not trifle with customs. For example, a custom that was made by Ezra and his court in the days of the Sanhedrin was to pray 3 times a day, Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. I don't think anybody today would question whether we should have those 3 prayers, even though they started out as a minhag, a custom. And that's why we say minhag Yisrael Torahu, that it could start out as a custom, and once it is accepted, it becomes like Torah law. Because originally, there were sacrifices, we didn't have obligatory 3 times a day prayers. But on the other hand, this was all known in advance. Abraham Avinu, our father Abraham, he was the one who designated praying Shacharis. Yitzchok designated Mincha. Yaakov designated Ma'ariv. And there's reasons why each prayer was connected with each one of those avos, maybe for another class. But in any case, no one would question the system of Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv today, and yet originally it was started as a custom. So we see the customs can take on very great force. I do want to mention that since the times of the Sanhedrin, as I briefly alluded to before, we had different groups of sages, Tanaim, the Mishnah, Moraim, the Gemara, the Saboraim, and the Gaonim, and then you had the Rishonim. The Rishonim were the early scholars, including the famous Rambam, including the Rosh, maybe you haven't heard of him, including the Rif, also very famous, and probably on a par with the Rambam, the next most famous would be Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So what these sages did, including famously the Rambam in his Yad HaChazaka, or the Mishnah Torah as it's called, the Rambam extrapolated the laws of the Gemara and put them in an encyclopedic form. Because until the Rambam came along, if you want to know a law, you have to be able to find your way through the whole Talmud to look it up, because the Talmud has discussions. So in the book of Shabbos, it could be laws about marriage or vice versa. So you had to know the whole Gemara, and it wasn't organized in a systematic way for a person who just wants to look up a law. Even a scholar to look up a law has to know the whole Gemara, which is hard. So the Rambam organized the laws of the Talmud into 14 volumes, and that was in the 12th century. Rabbi Yosef Karo, who lived in the 15th century, went a step further. He took all of the previous writings of the Rambam and others who had done similar writings, and he updated it for the conditions of the day, in other words, including the newer discoveries or the new conditions. And he only had 4 volumes, because the Rambam includes Karbano, sacrifices, things that have to do with the Beis HaMikdash. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, in his Shulchan Aruch, only had 4 volumes of things that apply on a practical day-to-day basis while we're in exile. And in the margins of this Shulchan Aruch, of this Code of Jewish Law, because Rabbi Yosef Karo was Sephardic, so the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, he put notes or glosses in the margins to indicate where the Ashkenazic ruling might be somewhat different. For example, Ashkenazim do not eat kitnius on Pesach, rice and beans and things like that, whereas the Sephardim do. But it clearly, everybody knows that that's not biblical, and the sages were very careful to stipulate what is biblical and what is not. So again, if a person, let's say, has a medical problem and they cannot keep Pesach 100%, rather eat rice than eat bread, because rice is only rabbinic and bread is biblical. But if you're healthy and you're Ashkenazic, don't eat either one. So it's clearly distinguished, but under normal conditions, we follow all the rules that were set forth both in the Torah and by the sages. I want to just conclude. I didn't teach an awful lot of what I prepared. I knew that was going to happen. I over-prepared, which is how a teacher is supposed to prepare. You'll forgive me for that. But I do want to conclude by showing an unbelievable significance of this oral Torah, and that is as follows. We all know that Hashem's plan from day one, even before he created the world, was to prepare the world for the ultimate coming of Mashiach, when the world will reach its real purpose, which is a world of complete goodness. We all know that. Mashiach is a descendant of King David, and King David is a descendant of the righteous convert Ruth. In the book of Ruth, it tells us that Ruth's righteous mother-in-law, Naomi, sent her widowed daughter to initiate a shidduch with Boaz, and so that the neshama of Mashiach would come through Boaz and Ruth. The problem was that Ruth was by birth a Moabite, and the Torah says that a Moabite shall not come into the congregation of God. A Jew is not allowed to marry a Moabite. That's what it says in the written Torah. And a lot of people opposed King David. They said, you're not a kosher Jew because your great-grandmother was a Moabite, and she wasn't allowed to really get married to Boaz. But in the oral Torah, which was only known, because remember, there were cases that were common and cases that were rare. This was a rare case. In the oral Torah, it says you may not marry a Moavi, but you may marry a Moavite. A Moavi is a male Moabite, and a Moavite is a female Moabite. So based on the oral Torah, Ruth was allowed to marry Boaz, who eventually became the ancestress of King David, from whom comes Mashiach. So we see a clear example in the written Torah, this is in the books of the Kesuvim, as we said at the beginning, that the oral Torah paved the way for the coming of Mashiach. And we are hoping that by observing the written, the oral, the customs, everything that's precious and holy to us, that we will indeed merit very, very soon the coming of Mashiach, when we will learn Torah on a whole new level, and all the Torah we learned for all these centuries was just a preparation for the amazing Torah we're going to soon be learning with Mashiach. I thank you for being an amazingly cooperative class. I see on your faces everybody was with me and participating in me and speak a lot, but I could see on your faces everybody was participating. And I want to thank you very much for joining our class. And I will schedule to teach one more class next week at this time. And I'll tell you in advance, the topic for next time is the prophets of Israel. Okay, so that will be not yours, but my final class with this particular group. So have a wonderful week. Thank you for being such wonderful students. And it's nice to see all your beautiful faces. And I look forward now that I'm much more relaxed. You know, each week I get a little more relaxed. I feel like I know you better each week. And I look forward to our next meeting next week. So please unmute yourselves. Wish each other a good week. And I'm going to give you a minute to just say hi to your friends.
You're a fantastic teacher. You are just absolutely
I do prepare.
Orientated. I have 5 pages of notes. I mean,
I just want to tell you one thing. Years ago, at the convention of Lubavitcher women, they asked me to give a workshop on teaching. And I said, I can't, because a workshop has to take a while, and my workshop will take under 10 seconds. Here's my workshop. Love your students and come well prepared. That's my whole workshop. So I do love my students, and I do prepare.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful week. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, everybody. All the best.
This was fabulous. Thank you. I could hear it again. I'd love to go over it again and
I
again.
think it's recorded. It is recorded. You can ask Rabbi Smith for the recording. Okay, all the best to everybody. See you next week.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Ziporah. Bye. Bye, all.
Bye, Naomi.
Bye.